Welcome back. We're going to begin lecture series 2, and this is called the dynamic environment. That's the theme of this lecture. Now you may be wondering, well, how does the environment tie into that other stuff we did in lecture 1 with the models, which is a very legitimate question. The environment, once you understand fundamentally what you feel, what you believe, or what you assume about the environment, then you have to start finding ways to characterize the environment, understanding kind of a refinement of the relationships between actors in business, government, society. So while the models look at, in a large sense, business has this effect, in a large sense, government has this effect, in a large sense, society has this impact or values, now we're going to start looking at refinements. Well, specifically, why might society act in this way in this situation? Specifically, why might a business act this way? So it's a little bit of a refinement. So that's what we're going to talk about in the dynamic environment. That's a funny idea too, isn't it? Dynamic environment. Well, to use the words of Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, you can never step in the same river twice. Now what that means is that everything is always flowing, moving, and changing. Pretty much the only thing that's totally still is dead. Okay? So relationships are always like that river, flowing, changing, and moving. I might call on some of my friends who say, let's manage stability, let's manage change. I would say, let's manage stability. When something is stable, actually that is very strange and much more interesting than when something is changing, because by default relationships are changing. Okay? So, we're going to start talking about the dynamic environment. And there's different levels of analysis, actually 3 different levels of analysis that we're going to cover. We're going to look at deep historical forces, the external environment, which is kind of like a proxy for the market, and then of course the internal environment of the firm. Okay? So first we're going to look at what we might call deep historical forces. So what is a deep historical force exactly? Well, deep historical forces are kind of like the foundation for pretty much everything else when it comes to the dynamic environment. They are typically environmental. Of course, we're going to use environment in a broad sense, not necessarily in terms of like natural resources, but also kind of like cultural, socio-political environment. They usually have a relatively unknown origin. They're mysterious. They provide a lot of energy for events. And typically they're things that you cannot necessarily predict that they're going to begin, and you can't necessarily predict how they're going to play out. Okay? But you can make predictions, and actually you can use scenarios to help guide you in that. That's what we're going to talk about in the next lecture. Okay? Now when we talk about these different aspects of the dynamic environment with deep historical forces, the market or external environment, and the internal environment, I do want to point out these divides are only used for teaching purposes. The divides are never all that distinct. Okay? And that also goes to the same for different aspects of the environment. Like, for example, with the deep historical forces, we'll talk about different elements. The divide between these is only for teaching purposes. It's usually kind of a blend. Okay, especially when you start looking at scenario building, you'll see how we blend these variables in different ways to form a cohesive narrative. So don't think that, well, that was an external environment piece, so therefore it can't be a historical force. It's not nearly that clear cut. That's what makes this stuff kind of complicated. In my opinion, that's what makes this class so interesting. If you don't like thinking out of the box, you may find this a little bit frustrating. Okay. So what's the first deep historical force? Well, it's the Industrial Revolution. Typically, we think that the Industrial Revolution began in England during the 1700s. We'll talk a lot more about that, not the next lesson, but the lesson after, kind of the origins of the Industrial Revolution. But basically, What's going on in the Industrial Revolution is a shift from more or less an agrarian or agriculture-based society or world, and you have people shifting more towards producing in a market and an industrialized economy. So people are moving from farms and the countryside to cities and factories. That's kind of the Industrial Revolution. That's how that's working. So you have a few requirements that are necessary for an Industrial Revolution. Okay? The first of all, you have to have a sufficiency of capital. Sufficiency of capital basically means that you have money to invest. Okay? You have to have a surplus of labor. You have to have people who have free time on their hands, and they can actually go and they can shift from working on a farm to a factory, as I mentioned in the last lecture. Okay? When my grandfather was growing up, he produced enough food basically for himself. However, when farming became more mechanized, he had time for other endeavors. Okay? And his children didn't have to work on the farm. They were able to move in the city. This is a good example of a surplus of labor. Of course, you have to have kind of a surplus of natural resources. Okay, the main natural resources that were drivers of the Industrial Revolution were, of course, well, in the early stages it was more like water power. But as the Industrial Revolution began to expand, we'll talk more about this in a couple lectures, the main natural resources necessary were, of course, steel and coal. Okay? And also an abundance of fuels, okay? Power grids that's sufficient. Okay? You also have to have countries with adequate transportation, because the Industrial Revolution has kind of an interesting dichotomy. You've got people in the countryside shipping food to the cities, and then, of course, in industrialized cities, you have people shipping their goods out to the countryside and then probably also to national and international markets. So you have to have a transportation network that's strong enough to support the logistical requirements of an Industrial Revolution. Of course, you have to have strong markets. A market economy is generally seen as a prerequisite for industrialization. However, the Soviet Union is a notable exception where industrialization took place even though there was not a free market economy. Nonetheless, there was a strong market in place. And of course, you have to have institutions in place designed to support an industrial revolution. You have to have a banking system that facilitates the accumulation of capital, so therefore loans can be made out to venture capitalists. You have to have a government that supports industrialization. You have to have people willing to go and work. Okay? These are all factors that are very important for launching an industrial revolution. And we'll talk more about this in this course. In the long run, industrial growth is usually seen to affect society in a positive way because people have more choice of goods and services. They have more choice between types of jobs they can take. And generally speaking, in the long run, it's seen to improve the quality of life. In the short run, there's typically negative strains on societies, particularly with kind of an erosion of social fabric. Values change. And sometimes that can be very dangerous for people in the short run. And it typically will promote short-term unemployment. Now, what is the short and the long run? That's kind of an issue of contention. Is the short run, a generation, or is it a couple of years? Is the long run, have we actually improved life over the past 300 years versus, a degradation of life over the past 10 years due to the Industrial Revolution? These are very tricky questions, and that's one of the things as a manager you're going to have to negotiate. Okay. However, I would point out, because of the Industrial Revolution, the amount of goods and service produced in the 20th century is actually greater than that produced in all of entire recorded human history. Okay? Because the machinery and the industrialization process has enabled a single laborer to produce hundreds, if not thousands of times more output than they could have in their early agrarian days. Okay? So that's the deep historical force of industrialization. Okay. The second one is what we know as inequality. Okay. I'm going to shift this over so hopefully you can see a little better. Now, typically we think of inequality as kind of some people in a country have a lot of money and other people in a country don't have that much money. However, when you look at it in terms of a deep historical force, we might actually talk more about while I don't deny that inequality within a nation is important, this is really focusing more on inequality between nations, okay? Richer countries and poorer countries, okay? And this source of, the haves and have-nots between countries is a source of perpetual conflict between the rich and the poor. Now, the industrialization or the Industrial Revolution further exasperated this amount of inequality between the rich and the poor. Okay? So the wealthy industrialists got a lot richer and the poor seemed to get poorer. However, I'll be right back.